If you were standing somewhere around AD 60 looking over the shoulder of this young man, Mark, who's trying to scribble out as best he can recollections and details and information that he's gathered, some of it from Peter, some of it from local knowledge, some of it from some of the other disciples and friends, some of it from being there in his mother's house when these young followers of the way came together. And if you'd suggested to him some sort of concept of the church as some sort of organization, he would have laughed his socks off. If you'd then gone on to suggest some sort of long-term future for this institution, he would have not even understood the concept. Even the later gospel writers that followed Mark, such as the writer of John's gospel, writing, much later, probably about 100 AD, they wouldn't have understood it either. Because they, like most of the followers of the way, were expecting Jesus to return and the world to end as they knew it. So, fast forward, you know the old-fashioned tape players where you'd press the fast forward button and it'd go fast forward 2,000 years. And we ask the question, that same question, is there a future for the church? And we ask it somehow from the perspective, unlike those early followers, that we want there to be. We want somehow this church to continue. Our love for the church, with all its faults, our love for this place compels us to want there to be a future. But we're not really sure what we mean by that. So let's just think about that this morning. And before we can even consider the question, the future of the church, we need to understand, of course, what the church is. Well, let's begin that consideration by first of all thinking about what the church is not. First of all, the church is not the building. You see, it's so easy to talk about St. Michael's or Wesley. It's so easy to talk about St. Peter's or St. Andrew's, and in so doing, what we're really meaning and what we're talking about is the bricks and mortar, which we can see and we can touch, and people outside the church, when you ask them about the church, their first thought is the building. You see, it's an easy thought to grasp hold of. The early church, for centuries, didn't have any buildings at all. They didn't exist. They met, like Mark did, in each other's homes, in small gatherings. And then when visiting preachers would rock up, like Paul, and indeed Jesus during his ministry, they perhaps would be invited into a local synagogue or to preach in a public place. At the time of the empire, the Roman Empire, there was always places where people could speak. It was an important part of the whole structure of society, and those ministers or priests or prophets, whatever you want to call them, would be invited to speak in those or from those places. But there was no such thing as church buildings. They did not exist. This building is beautiful. I love it. It is, in my view, the grandest and the most beautiful building of any church building in this city. It's a fantastic piece of architecture. Its design is wonderful. It's got a great history. It's got terrific acoustics and superb vision that everybody can sort of see the central point at any one time. But that is what it is. It is a building. It is not the church. I've told some of you this story before. I remember when I was living in a little village in country side in the UK, and there was this tiny little church building there. It was an Anglican church. It had been there for a few years, and nobody went to it. It was in pretty bad state. So the Anglican church decided they were going to just close it down. There was massive response from that village. There was a task group and a working group and an action group, and people signed petitions, and there were protests to the bishop. And eventually, after all that, it was decided that the building that had been destined for demolition was going to be saved. The building was saved. Still, nobody went to it. It just stood there empty, week in and week out. The people in the village weren't even interested in what we might call the Christian message. Somehow, they wanted a building. The first thing when we're trying to define the church is that it's not a building. Secondly, this. It is not the institution. We often hear, don't we, different parts of the church described as the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Uniting Church. And then we hear phrases, often in media, we say, well, the Catholic Church says this. This is the Uniting Church's view, if it ever did make its mind up about anything, on this. There's always a quote from the institution. But listen, the institution is definitely not the church. One only has to go to any one of the boring, sleepy, non-decision-making meetings of synod or assembly or convocation or whatever to quickly realize that this institution does not in any way represent the firebrands of the early church who laid their life on the line. Those disciples who took the gospel around the world and in many cases died for it. It does not represent the martyrs of the faith. It does not represent the great, great saints and leaders of our past. No Martin Luthers here are hammering their declarations of belief which changed the world. No George Fox, no John Wesley's, no William Booth, no Martin Luther King Jr., all fighting for what they saw as the outworkings of their faith. No. But in our institutions, there are lots of working parties and subcommittees and papers for consideration and motions seeking proposers and seconders. No, the church is definitely not the institution. And nor is it a group of people who learn and recite a set of beliefs or creeds. and then having done that, dogmatically stick to them. However incongruous and ridiculous they might be, when you put them alongside modern scholarship, they hold firm. Here's a sample of those taught and learned beliefs that don't stand up at any level in today's world. Listen to them. Firstly, the inspiration of Scripture as the literal, revealed Word of God. 2, the virgin birth as the miraculous and literal means by which the divine nature of Christ has been guaranteed. 3, the substitutionary view of the atonement that was accomplished in the death of Jesus, the affirmation of the saving power of his blood, and the gift of salvation that was accomplished by his death. 4, the certainty of the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead, the accuracy of both the empty tomb and the appearance stories in the gospel tradition. 5, the truth of the second coming of Jesus, the reality of the day of judgment, which would be based on the record of one's life, and the certainty of heaven and hell as eternal places of reward and punishment. Crazy though those things sound today, there's a huge chunk of people within the institution of what we call the church who will hold fast by them. But they are now just naive and eminently rejectable. And nor would any of them be supported in our generation by reputable Christian scholars. So that's what it isn't. Now let's consider what we think the church is. We need to think about that first before we can speculate on its future. I've written a definition. I've made it up. I don't suppose it stands up to theological scrutiny, and I haven't found it in any theological textbook or catechism. It's not in any book of common prayer. It was compiled by the Rev Ric Holland in his study on Wednesday evening. You can take it whatever way you want. Here is my quote for the definition of what the church is. The Christian church is a group of people who come together to share and express spirituality, following the way of Jesus of Nazareth, and who demonstrate that by word and deed. So, in other words, simply it's about believing and it's about doing. It's about doing the work of the church. That's what the church is. It's people who do its work. When I was a young minister up in Glasgow, in my first church, after the first service had finished, one of the elders of the church said to me, "Minister," he said, "what normally happens after the service on a Sunday morning, we invite the minister to join us at the Ochannan Bowling Club." And I said, "Oh, right." I said, "Yes, the minister usually comes." And I said, "Well, I don't bowl. I don't know anything about bowls." "Oh, that's okay." And so off I went with this bunch of elders in the church to the bowling club. When I got there, I sort of thought it was a bit odd when I passed this bit of grass which looked a bit overgrown and didn't seem too much like a bowling club to me. The law in Scotland at the time was that all pubs weren't allowed to open on a Sunday, except for clubs. And so the Occonan Bowling Club was a wonderful way to get round the legal legislation which said no drinking on a Sunday. And my elders and the minister from time to time would join them at that club. Not much bowling went on, let me tell you. Many of its membership, like myself, had never picked up a greens bowl in my life, nor would they ever. It called itself a bowling club, but it wasn't. We can call ourselves the church, that's easy. But we can only demonstrate that we are the church by inextricably linking what we do and what we believe. For our church is about doing the future. Then consider what that means for the church, because, you see, I believe it is only by what we do that we've got a future. Let's just think about the functions of the church as my definition of a moment ago. The first function I believe that the church has is a teaching function. The church today must address its teaching role very, very seriously. The level of theological and biblical understanding within the present church is woeful. And of course, it's even worse from people outside the church. And what we have from people outside the church, we have a rejection of an understanding of the church which was even outdated in the Middle Ages. And this is reinforced by those who still cling on to those religious and biblical fundamentalist concepts like the ones I read just a moment ago. And it's also reinforced by many clergy, and it is absolutely true and it's shocking. It's reinforced by many clergy who are not honest with their congregations for fear of upsetting them, or even worse, destroying the power of relationship that the institution has over its people. It holds its people, as it has done for centuries, I believe, with an iron hand of power and control. When I was a young bloke, and I've got to tell you this, this was before, I say again, before I had any influence upon the church on my life, okay? So you can understand that I probably wasn't a very morally behaved young bloke at the time. And one of the jobs that I set up myself, I lived in as most of you will know, in Blackpool, which is a very tacky holiday town in the north of England. It's pretty rough and ready and cheap and nasty. And there is on the front of Blackpool an area that's called the Golden Mile. And it's all these little sort of what we call spruikers and guys selling stuff and everything. And I've told you one of these two stories before, but I don't think I've told you that I used to sell what we used to call 15-day watches. They were 15-day watches because we reckoned nobody ever went to Blackpool for more than a fortnight. And they were very flash watches, but they were absolutely awful. And I used to sell these watches. You'd sell 50 of them in a morning because they looked really, really good, and you certainly were ripping off the public without any question. I believe that the leadership of the institution of the church the leadership and its clergy still today sells shonky watches. And they do that to keep the institution going. Remember last week when I quoted Lorraine Parkinson's books not being allowed into theological hall for fear of testing the faith of theological students? What nonsense. We have a really, really important teaching function to explain and to describe to people both inside and outside the church what it's all about. The second thing we have is what we call its healing function. This for centuries has been central to the role of the church. But again, as I was saying last week, most of it has been shelved off to institutions like hospitals and chaplains. We've always understood this in St. Michael's, but let's grow it and develop it further. We must always recognize people's suffering caused by circumstances beyond their control and take action to reduce that suffering. The healing function. Thirdly, the compassion function. You see, we don't believe in a judging God, do we? We believe in a spirit of compassion and love. And so we must demonstrate that same compassion and love towards other people. It's fairly easy when we see people who have a disability or people who are grieving. We reach out, of course, with compassion towards them. But we find it a bit harder, don't we? Towards the drug addict, towards the prisoner, towards people with a gambling addiction, even towards people who are homeless or refugees or Muslims or people who don't like us, towards people who don't look like us, but people who smell and who don't respect our conventions. People for whom we might say, well, it's just their own fault. They've made their own bed, lie on it. But you see, compassion has no boundaries. It doesn't for Jesus of Nazareth, and nor should it for us. It's an important function of our church. The fourth function, it's community function. We must make every effort to bind together groups of people who have become alienated or whose interest appears to be in opposition to each other. We must commit ourselves to breaking down racism and bigotry. We must be multi-faith and multicolored. We must consistently listen to the world and our own community and be constantly asking the question, what can we do about it? We must be actively involved in mainstream media and social media. And what resources we have in our church must be stretched to their limits in responding to community need and issues. We must be screaming out and demonstrating our opposition to social inequality and injustice, our community function. And then, fifthly, we have a righteousness function. This is the point at which the church must tackle the view of the Christian faith, this view that some people have. You've heard it many times. Christianity and politics don't mix. There is a view, you see, that Christianity is a personal thing, that faith is something about the individual. It's about me. It's about my spirituality. It's about my relationship with God. And at its extreme form, it says, and you've all heard this, all you have to do is to accept Jesus into my heart as my Savior and you'll be all right. This religion is about me, me, me. What can this faith do for me? Whereas, of course, Christianity is about us. It's all about us. From here and out there. It's about us in the church. It's about us in the world. Our family stretches across all borders. And we cannot ignore issues which are affecting our brothers and sisters in countries where governments are exploiting and abusing them. We cannot ignore members of our human family who are abused and ignored and rejected. We cannot ignore our brothers and sisters who have had to escape war and hostility, and they've sought refuge in another country for safety. We cannot ignore our brothers and sisters whose sexuality makes them unequal. We cannot ignore our brothers and sisters who are not being treated equally in our own country. Or should I more properly say, their country, as it has at least been for 60,000 years. It's more, I believe, about sociology than psychology. And as we consider our worldwide family, we must also include in the world and in that consideration the very place that we live, that world. How can we stand back and see our world being destroyed by pollution, over-farming, mining, and destruction? How can we not be concerned about the world in which we will hand on to our future generations? We have to do something about it. We have to agitate for change. Remember Oscar Wilde's words. Agitators, he said, are a set of interfering, meddling people who come down to some perfectly contented class of the community and sow the seeds of discontent amongst them. That is why, he says, agitators are so absolutely necessary. We have to agitate. We have to see the opportunity for change, and often those things need political action, and we, the church, should be fighting for them. The sixth function of the church is what I call its gathering function, because central to our church is meeting together. It is vital to share, to grow in understanding, to support, to inspire, to learn, to express, to sing, to laugh together. The important power of laughter as far as healing is concerned is often overlooked. Recent studies, and here I quote from the National Geographic magazine, show that regular religious services improve the immune system, decrease blood pressure, and add years to our lives. It goes on to say that religious faith has the ability to make us, notice us, has the ability to make us feel inexplicably better. And I would want to go further than that to say faith can make the community and the world better. It can also, as we've seen, make it worse. That's why it's vital to make our message and our work inclusive and not exclusive. So here we go as we think about the future of the church. And you might think over the months that I've been in this pulpit that I've been knocking the church big time. I am its first critic, but at the same time, I am its first servant. I believe passionately in the church. I believe in its future. I want to fight to ensure that it has a future. And I believe that this church, St. Michael's, is called by the Spirit to lead that future. And I can think of no other church better equipped to do that. You see, we can create and maintain a strong teaching function, offering an informed and academic understanding of faith. Yes, we can be a healing hand in a painful world. Yes, we can demonstrate compassion and love rather than judgment and censor. We can act, yes, as a catalyst, bringing disparate and often opposing views together towards a better understanding of each other. Yes, we can be prophetic as we make a stand for righteousness and change, often in a world screaming out for reconciliation. And yes, we will continue to meet here together to learn and to laugh, to reflect and to share, and to believe in our future together. It was George Horace Lorimer who once said, "The first essential of a quiet funeral is a willing corpse." St. Michael's is not that. We're not a willing corpse. British author, some of you might remember, a great author, died about 10 years ago, Monica Furlong. One of her books, With Love to the Church, let me just quote from it. She says, "Within the strange, sprawling, quarreling mass of the churches, within their stifling narrowness, their ignorance, their insensitivity, their stupidity, their fear of the truth, I perceive another church, one which is really Christ at work in the world. In this new church, people don't judge. Their own relationship make it possible for others to grow. It doesn't matter what their circumstances are, what their physical and mental limitations are. They are really free. They are the prisoners. We are the prisoners who have been released and who in turn can release others. This is us. This church, St. Michael's, we can turn the world upside down. Together we can truly shake the foundations. And having celebrated the new faith, we can now celebrate the new church. And yes, we can. We can truly create a church for the future, starting right here on Collins Street, or should I say, starting right here in this building. This is our future, this is our hope, and we can make it happen. Thank you.